In this video we are going to create the UI for our chat application, but before doing that let's create a method so that we can store our username and we don't have to enter it again and again over here every time we refresh it. And to do that we will be using local storage and store our username in our local storage. So go back to our Visual Studio Code and over here go to pages index.js file, and on create username handler let's remove the console log, and just below this use local storage dot set item, and we'll set a username over here in a key called username. Save this, and now let's go to our component chat container. So let's create a state over here to check if the username exists. And let's set it to true by default. Now we can initialize it only when we are on our client side application. So let's use effect. And inside this we'll check if we have the local storage, and if we have username key. If that's the case, we will set is username exists as true. Otherwise we will set it false. And over here when we are creating a model, we will also make a check. If there is no username existing, then only we will create our model. So let's save that and see what we see on a UI. So over here we see our model. Let's enter a username and then click on create, and if we now refresh it, we don't see the model again. And let's see if we have it stored on our local storage. So go to our application and you can see username has the username over here. So let's close this now and get back to the UI creation for our application. So our application will have two sections. One is the left side section which will store the room list, and on the right side we will have the chat between multiple users. So let's go to chat container, and over here let's remove this div completely. And now let's create another div from scratch, and in this div we will have a class name, and we will give this class py-5 for padding from top and bottom, and similarly we will give it px4 for a padding from left and right side. And inside this we will create another div, and this div will have a class of row, and we will also give it overflow hidden. Also we'll give it shadow and some margin from top. Inside this give another div. This will be a column 5 div. So let's give it a class name of column 5 and padding from left and right to 0. It will also have another div for our chat messages. So let's give it another class name and we will give it column of 7 and also padding of 0. Let's format this and save it once. Also we'll be giving it a header so that we can show some button for creating the rooms as well as some basic information. So let's do that. Let's create header UI as a variable, and we'll use header element for it. Let's use class name. We'll give it class as text center, and inside this we'll have a h1 tag. We can write real-time group chat inside it. Also we can have a paragraph, and let's give this also a class name with margin bottom 0. And similarly for the h element, Let's give it a class name, and we can give display 4 from Bootstrap. We can also show a button. We will work on it later on, but let's create it right now, and it would be of type button. It will have class name from Bootstrap, that is button, and it can have button primary. The content would be create room. Let's format the code and save it. Let's show this header UI just above our chat section. Let's move it inside our div and save this and see on our browser. So we have a decent UI on our browser, and let's see why our paragraph element is not being shown. So we have not written anything over here. Let's write something, say collaborate with developers worldwide. Let's save this now and let's go back to our browser. It looks good, but we can give it a class from Bootstrap that's lead, and also if we have some bottom margin it would look good. So let's do that in our code. So let's give this paragraph a class of lead and margin bottom of 2 and save this. So our UI looks better now, and let's go back to our code and work on the chat side for the rooms as well as the messages. So inside our chat container, create a folder called room container and create another folder called chatbox container. Save it. Now let's create JSX files for our room container. Similarly, let's create JSX files for chatbox container. Also, let's create the CSS files for them. Again, let's create functional components for the same. Functional component for room container, save it. Also create functional component for our chatbox container and save it. Also we'll import the styles for it. Similarly for room container. And save it. Now let's call this room container and chatbox container inside our chat container. So first of all, import them. Import room container. Similarly, import chatbox container. And we will have our room container on the left side. So let's declare that over here. And we will have our chatbox container on the right side. So let's call it over here and save it. And let's see what appears on our UI. Okay, so we have our application looking fine. Like we will be showing rooms on the left side and the chat on the right side. That's good. But we have this additional semicolon. So let's remove this. Let's see from where it is coming. So it comes inside this container. So let's go back and see. So inside our underscore app.js, we have a semicolon over here inside our layout. So let's remove this and save and go back to our browser. So now we can see that the semicolon does not appear, and you can close this console. Now let's first work on the room container and then we will work on the chatbox container. So now inside our chat container, go to room container JSX file, and over here let's create a temporary list of rooms. So let's call it rooms list is equals to, and here we will have a property called name. Let's say room number 1 for now. Also it will have a date called created at, and we'll call it new date. Similarly, let's copy it. And then this will have a name called room number 2. And let's save it. And remove this room container text from here. And on this div, let's declare a class name. And we can leave it now as we don't need this. And inside this, let's create another div. Also, we'll need another div after this. In the first div, we will be showing the list of rooms, so we'll give it something meaningful in the name. So in the first div, we will show a text called rooms simply, so that user can understand that there will be list of rooms over here. So let's create a span over here, and it will be having a text called rooms. And on this span, we'll give class name, and then it would be something like h5, and we don't need a margin, so we'll give it margin bottom. And we need some padding from top and bottom, so we'll give it padding y1. Also, the div above it, we can give it background gray, as well as we can give it padding from left and right, so give it px4. And similarly from top and bottom, let's give it py2. Also, we can try out some more things at the time we have the application UI rendered. So before that, let's do rendering of the room list. So let's go over here, and we'll give it a class from styles that we will be creating. So let's give it styles.roombox, and inside this we will be having another div. This div would be a wrapper of all the rooms, so let's give it a class called list group. And it would not be rounded, so let's give it rounded 0. And padding from left and right px2. And now inside this, we will loop over our rooms list, so let's call it rooms list.map. And here we will have our room and room index, so let's take that. And for each room, we will be returning the UI. Let's create a div inside this. And let's give it a class. And we have given its parent a class of list group, so we'll have to give it a class of list group item. And similarly, list group item action, so that it can be clicked. And we will again give it rounded 0, some margin from top and bottom, so let's give it my2. And inside this item, we will again create a div, and on this div we'll give class, and we'll give some margin from left, so let's give margin left 4. And let's create another div inside this to show our room name as well as its created date. So on this div, we'll again give class name, and it would be display flex, and align items to the center. And we'll justify content as justify content in between. And we will also give it margin bottom, let's say 1. Over here, let's give it h6, and we can give it a class name again, and we can give it margin bottom as 0. Let's show the name over here, and the name would be room.name. Let's fix the typo. And just below the h6, we'll be showing the date, so let's show it over here. And we can again give it a class name. We can give it small text as well as font weight bold. For now, we can simply write down the date directly, and later when we have the date, we will use it. So let's right now use, let's say, 1st April, and then save it. So let's see what appears on our UI. So in our application, if we go back to the browser, we have our room names listed like this, which looks good and clean to me. So now let's work on the chat box container and we will show the messages over here. Also before that, since we have our UI up and ready, what we can do is we will create a separate component for the repeated code, and let's call it room. And let's create JSX for it. And let's create a React functional component for this. Let's cut this code from here and replace this div with our code. Let's format the code, and this will receive two arguments. One is the room name and second argument will be created at date. Let's fix this and remove the room.name to name. Save this for now and go back to our container. Over here, let's import the room. And let's call this room over here. We can also remove these brackets and we can directly call our room like this, but we have to pass our name over here. So let's pass the name like room.name, and we will have our created date. So let's pass created at is equals to room.created at. Let's format our code and save it, and let's see if the UI looks same. So our UI still looks the same and it looks good. So let's proceed with the chat box container again. So in our components, go to chat container, open chat container, and let's open the JSX file for it. Also in our room container, we will have to pass a key props on our room, otherwise the browser will give warning. So let's pass key as room index for now and save this. This should be unique. You should use UUID4 or something similar in order to generate dynamic UI IDs. But for now, let's go with room index for simplicity and get back to our chat box container. And on this, remove this chat box container text and let's create a class. And instead of using string, let's use tilt for it so that we can pass dynamic classes inside it. And once we have it, we can use display flex from Bootstrap. So let's use dflex. Also we'll have it in the column format. So let's use flex column. And we will also use justify content between. And we'll give it padding bottom 0. So inside this div we will have two parts. First is the list of messages which will be scrollable, and just below that we will be having a send message button and an input field. So let's create the messages scrollable part, and to do that create a div, and inside this div we will have the list of messages. So before that let's create a class name for it, and for this we will again be having dynamic styles. So let's use tilt for it, and let's give it scroll and padding from left and right such as px4, and we can give a dynamic class later on. Let's do the simple stuff first, and here we'll be having a list of messages. So let's create some temporary messages over here. We'll be replacing these later on using our socket.io. It will have two fields for now. We can add more later on. So one would be the name from the message sender and the message of the sender, and let's say it hi, and let's call another sender as guest for now, and the message would be how are you. Let's save this. Also we can change the name from full name to our username so that we can show the messages in left and right format since the start. So let's do like this and save this, and now we will iterate over the messages over here similar to how we iterated over the rooms using messages.map, and we'll have the property called message and the message index. Let's close this bracket, and over here again we'll be having a div. So let's create a div inside the function. Before that, let's fix this bracket issue. I think that's fine now, we don't have any error. One more thing we need is we need a username to compare the message sender username and the username of the logged in user. So let's go to our index.js file, and over here we will pass the username down to chat container. Let's pass it over here. So we have a username passed to the chat container. So let's go to the chat container. Over here we will receive the username. So let's pass that over here to the props. And similarly, let's pass that to our chat box container like this, and save this. So we'll receive the same over here in our chat box container. So let's take it over here and again save it. So here we will have to place the sender's message on the left and receiver, that is us, on the right side. So what we can do is let's remove this bracket and let's use curly brackets to enclose our div for now. Later on what we will do is we will create a separate component for it once we have the messages shown in the right way. Just above this div we will have a variable for our message box container. So let's call it let message box container class. And this would be empty by default, but in case if we have a username is equals to message dot name of the sender, in case this is us, then we will be showing the messages on the right side, otherwise we will be showing them on the left side. So for that, first let's go on our div and then use class name is equals to, and we'll be using display flex, and we'll align items to the center. Let's also have another div inside it, and it will have padding from left hand side such as px2, and inside this we'll have a span to show our author name. We'll give it a class and it would be of class name, and over here let's show the name of the author and it would be message.name. And just below this span we'll use a paragraph, and inside this message we will have our message rendered like message.message. So let's save this, and also we need to return our dom.jsx. So let's save it and now see what appears on our UI. So you can see the messages appear on our UI, but the message for which we are sending is not appearing on the right side. So let's fix that. So in the condition that we have shown over here, if it's our message, in that case we will add classes to show the message on the right side. So first class that we will be using is text right. This will align our text on the right side. Let's see what appears on the screen once we save it and add it to our list. So to add it to our list, let's change the class to dynamic way, and we'll use taller class name that we are having dynamically, and then join using spaces, and this will join the classes that we are adding dynamically with spaces over here. Let's save this and see on the browser. Also before that, let's add key for it over here. Key is equals to message index. Format the code and save this once again. So if we check our browser, our username doesn't still shows on the right side. This is because we have checked the username in local storage only in our model that creates a username, not on our root element where we have our index.js. So to do that, go back to our code, and over here inside our index.jsx, 'x, where we are initializing our socket, let's check. if we have local storage, as well as in this local storage if we have our username. Let's check that if we have it. Then let's set the username to the one we have set in our local storage and click on save. And now if we go back to our browser, we can see that the username is still on the left, but when we inspect it, we can see that the text-right class has been applied, and to the one below it, the text-right doesn't apply. This is because the content inside the div aligns itself to the right side, but the div itself is not aligned to the right side. So let's fix that. Going back to our application, let's close index.jsx and chat container. And in our chatbox container file, we have text right over here. We'll also add a class called justify content and let's save it now and see our browser. And you can see our username shows on the right side and the guest username shows the message on the left side, but the UI does not looks good enough for now. So let's improve our UI before we proceed further. Also, first let's move this code in a separate component. Let's create a message box component and then create a JSX file inside it. And we can cut the entire code from here. Let's create a React functional component over here. And inside this, we can remove this return statement and paste the component code that we have copied over here and format it. So this will need some arguments. First argument is the username. Second argument would be the name for the message. So let's call it name. And another argument that we'll be needing is the message itself. So let's save this for now and go back to our chatbox container, and over here let's import this message box. And let's remove this curly braces and return our message box instead of it. And let's pass the props for name, message and username. And let's format this code. Also, we'll be passing our key over here. And we can remove the key from this div in our message box and save it. Also, let's format this code and save it over here and check the browser. So we have an error over here. This is because we have a typo over here in the message box. So let's fix this quickly. Inside our message box, let's use username, and instead of message.name, we will be comparing it to the name directly. And similarly over here, we'll be showing it directly like this on name. And I think that's fine for now, and let's save it. And now everything works like how it worked before. So let's go back to our code and improve the UI and add the input for the message as well as send button. Now let's go to our chatbox container, and over here we will add a class. And call it chatbox container, and we'll use it in our CSS file. We'll give it a background color, as well as we can give it some other properties, but let's see what appears for now. So it looks good right now. We can improve it more. So just below our messages, let's create another div, and inside this div we will have an input element and a button. For input, we will give class. We'll have some padding at the start, so let's give ps2. We'll give it a placeholder stating type a message. Similarly, for the button, we will have class of button and button success, and we will have a text message called send. And let's save this to see what appears on the UI. Let's fix the typo before that, and also let's add classes for the parent of this div, and we'll give it display flex, also justify content between, and save this. And now you can see that a send button appears on the right side and the message box appear on the left side. And now let's make the width of this message box appear up to the send button. And to do that, let's again make the input as a dynamic class. So let's enclose this inside curly braces, as well as change the string literal. PS2 remains same. We will need some padding at the start, as well as we'll need the class for input box. So let's call it message input. So there is a dot between message and style. And now save it. Go back to the CSS file. Over here we can give message input. Let's confirm the name. We can give it width of approximately 95%, as well as we can give it some font weight of 400, and we can disable the border and make it none. Also we'll disable the border on focus, so let's do that as well. On focus, we'll make the outline as none. Let's format the code and save it, and let's go back to our browser and see the message input. So this looks good, but it would be great if we had a fixed height for our message list, and we can do that too. So going back to our Visual Studio Code, so just below our chatbox container we will add another class. Let's call it chatbox wrapper. And go to our CSS file now, and this will have a fixed height of, let's say, 500 pixels, as well as we can give it overflow on y-axis, that is overflow on the top and bottom, and only on these it will be scrolling. So let's save this now. Save this over here as well, and on our browser you can see that it looks much better now. Also in our chat box container, let's enclose our button inside another div, and let's give this class name, and then display flex, as well as justify content center. And padding at the end of, let's say, padding end 3, and save it.